What you've been learning in Chagiga up until now is starting certainly with the second parak, is the whole concept of rabbinic stringencies that were put into place in order to ensure that people who were meticulous about the laws of Tum and Tahara would be able to retain that purity. It's already rolling from what I'm given. If you want to check, maybe just to make sure. So the reason why this is introduced in Maseches Chagiga, as we'll see, is because the Shalosh Regalim was a time when Jews from all over Eretz Yisrael would gather, both people who were meticulous about the laws of Tumah, and Amei Haaretz, people who were not so meticulous. And so this only created an additional reason for the rabbis to be machmir, to be stringent about laws of Tumah. And so most of the laws that we're reading about now are purely rabbinic in nature. That there were certain chumras that were put into place to preserve a certain level of tahara for those who were really, really machmir. And what the Mishnah had told us on DAF Yud Ches Amud Beis, is that if a person is wearing certain clothes with the intention of eating chulin in a state of tahara, that doesn't automatically mean that those clothes are considered to be tahor if he wants to eat truma. And similarly, if a person wants to eat truma with certain clothing, since he's watching them to make sure that they're tahor for his eating of truma, that's fine and very well and good for their purity as far as eating truma and chulin. But for the higher level of kedusha, which is taharos, which means sacrificial items, those clothing are considered to be tamei. And this is all rabbinic in nature. Okay, we want to remind you this is all rabbinic in nature. Okay, and the Mishnah had listed 5 different levels. The Mishnah had listed Bigdei Am Haaretz Midrash Leprushin, that the clothing of an Am Haaretz, who's someone who's not careful about the laws of Tum and Tahara, are considered to be tamei for anyone who's a Pharisee, someone who's meticulous. And Bigdei Prushin Midrash Le'ochlei Truma, a person who's a Prushi, meaning that he's careful always to eat chulin in a state of tahara, his clothing are considered to be tamei for a person, let's say a Kohen, who wants to eat truma. And Bigdei Ochlei Truma Midrash L'Kodesh, and the clothing of a person who eats truma is considered to be tamei for a person who wants to eat kodshim. And Bigdei Kodesh Midrash L'Chatos. And the highest level is that even if you're wearing clothing, you want to eat sacrificial items, kodshim, right? But your clothes will still be tamei for a person who needs to handle the water and ashes of the para aduma. So you see that just because you're meticulous about tumah and tahara, your clothing could still be considered to be tamei for a person who's working on something even holier than that. Okay?
If chulin's the lowest level, is that everything?
What is what? Chulin.
That's the lowest level.
Chulin is food that has no inherent sanctity.
So that's everything. Isn't that everything?
That's everything except for truma and kodshim.
Right, but what I mean to say is the guy that's not about being tahor to eat chulin, that he can't eat anything unless he's tahor.
Well, he's machner, so he doesn't eat anything until he's in a state of tahara.
Right, so
correct. Correct. Yeah. Okay. So comes along the Gemara on the bottom of Yud Tes Amud Beis, and it says, Amar Rav Mori Shma Mina Chulin Shenasu Al Taharas HaKodesh KeKodesh Damu. I can infer from our Mishnah that if a person always eats chulin, but treats the chulin with the same sanctity as he does as kodshim, a sacrificial meat, and Rashi tells me, why would a person do that? Rashi says, Adam harog yelechol kodshim mekabel of lechol chulin b'taharas hakodesh. Why will a person do that? Because he regularly eats kodshim. Let's say he's a Kohen, he regularly works in the Beis HaMikdash, and he does it so kadeshu b'nei vesu zehirinu b'kiin b'taharas hakodesh. He wants his household members to be very meticulous also, because they may come in contact with the kodshim items that he's consuming, and therefore he admonishes them that any food that we eat, you eat an apple, you eat a pear, whatever you're going to eat, please make sure that you treat it as if it's kodshim, as if it's sacrificial meat. And so therefore, if a person does that, then we can assume that his clothing have the same level of purity as a person who wears clothes when he's eating kodshim. Now, how can we infer that? Midelo ketani behu maila. the very fact that the Mishnah did not give it its own level. The Mishnah went from, if you eat if you're a chulin eater with tahara, then your clothing is tamei for a truma eater. If you're a truma eater, then your clothing is tamei for a kachim eater. And if you're a kachim eater, then your clothing is tamei for a person who handles the para aduma. Now, there's no middle category in between that says if you're a truma eater, your clothing is tamei for a person who eats chulin al taras hakodesh, right? That category is missing. So therefore, we must assume that it's subsumed under a person who eats kachim. So therefore, just like a person who eats kachim, his clothing is tahor for everyone except someone who handles the paraduma, so to a person who eats chulin al taharas hakodesh, treating it as if it's kachim, his clothing will be tahor for everyone except someone who's handling the paraduma. The Gemara says, Mimai. So how do you know that? That word's not there. It's Vidilma, Hi, Delo Ketani Behumaila, the idamu l'truma hatani truma, the idamu l'chulin hatani l'chulin. So the Gemara says not necessarily so. You're right, there is no special category of a person who eats chulin al taharas hakodesh, but that doesn't indicate to us that he's exactly like a person who eats kachim. Maybe he's more like a person who eats chulin, or maybe he's more like a person who eats truma. Maybe he's subsumed under those categories, and I'll show you that there are those who hold that if you eat, even when you eat chulin al taharas hakodesh with the status of assigning it kachim, you nevertheless don't get upgraded to a person who's eating kachim, but you're only either at the status of a person who eats chulin or a person who eats truma. How can I show this to you? Tanya chulin shenasu al taharas hakodesh, as the Brisa says explicitly, when you eat chulin and treat it with the same holy status as kachim, harei hein kechulin. The Tana Kama says that the food is just like chulin, and presumably that means, therefore, your clothing are also like a chulin eater, and therefore, even though your clothing are tohar for chulin eating, they're considered to be tamei for truma eating. And Rabbi Elazar Reb Tzadok Omer harei hein kitruma, and Rabbi Elazar Reb Tzadok says, no, I hold that when you eat chulin al taharas hakodesh, you have the status of a truma eater, and therefore your clothing are tohar for both a chulin eater and a truma eater, and they're only going to be tamei for a kachim eater. So the Gemara says you can't prove it from that part from our Mishnah, ela miseifa. But here's the part of our Mishnah that indicates that when you eat chulin al taharas hakodesh, then you're like a kachim eater, and your clothes are like the clothing of a kachim eater, because it says Yossi ben Yoezer hayachasid shebekahuna. So first it talked about Yossi ben Yoezer, and it says that he was very pious in the kahuna, and even though he was very pious and he always ate his truma in a state of kedusha, but his handkerchief had the status, since it wasn't his big day kahuna handkerchief, right? It was his regular civi clothes. Therefore, his handkerchief could not be used in the context of eating kachim. Okay, that's number one. Yochanan ben Gudgada, and this is the crucial line, there was another Tana named Yochanan ben Gudgada, Haya ochel al taras hakodesh kol yamav, v'haysa matfachto midras lechatas, that he was a person who ate his chulin al taras hakodesh, treating all of his chulin like kachim, and all of his life, his handkerchief would only be considered to be tamei for a person who had to handle the para aduma. Lechatas in lekodesh lo. So you see that it was only for para aduma handlers that his handkerchief would be considered to be tamei. But for anyone less than that, so for example, for a kachim eater, his handkerchief would be considered to be tahor. So alma kisaber chulin shenasu al taras hakodesh kekodesh dama. This conclusively proves that our Mishnah is of the opinion that if you eat chulin al taras hakodesh, upgrading it to the status of kachim, then we treat your clothes as a kachim eater, and therefore you can eat kachim with that same clothing. Now, in the same vein, we're going to talk about all of these different chumras that existed among the Prushi community in order to preserve their high level of tahara. Amar Rabbi Yonasan ben Elazar, nafla ma'afarto heimenu, Amar lachaveru tenali v'nasna lo temeya, that if a person drops his handkerchief by accident, and he says to his friend, "Hey, my friend, would you mind picking that up for me?" If his friend picks it up, even though his friend was tohar, but when his friend gives him the handkerchief is now tamei, automatically. Even if both the person from whom it fell and the person picking it up are both tahor. Now, I just want to remind you that all of these laws are very abstract for us, for whom these laws are not nogei l'maisa. So sometimes, like, I study these laws periodically, but I always forget them every time I study them. I have to remind myself because they're not in practice. So just, it's sometimes these laws may seem very abstract, but for people who were living in this community, they were very, very practical laws. Amar Rabbi Yonasan ben Amram, Nischalfu lo kelim shel Shabbos bekelim shel chol v'lavshan nitmu. Here's another halacha from Rabbi Yonasan ben Amram. He says, let's say you think you're putting on chulin clothing during the week, and you accidentally put on your Shabbos clothing, if you're. You don't want to turn on the light in the closet because your wife is still sleeping. So you pull out your suit or whatever you're going to wear, and you accidentally put on your Shabbos suit instead of your weekday suit. So the halacha is that now becomes tamei. That also becomes tamei. And apparently it seems that anytime there's a case of mistaken identity, according to this statement, the fabric becomes tamei. If you think it's A and it's really B, then it becomes tamei.
Permanently. You ever fix that?
No, sure, you take it to the mikveh.
Your suit cleaner.
Yeah. Well, a suit you could take to the mikveh because maybe it's made out of material that's not going to shrink.
So it's not forever. That's right.
Right, because any fabric can be taken to the mikveh to be purified. Amar Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok, Ma'isa b'shtei nashim chavera shenischalfu lahem kleim beveis hamerchatz. So we once had a story like this where you had two women who accidentally, they went to the bathhouse together, and when it was time for them to get redressed, they accidentally switched clothing. Okay? So, Uba Ma'isa lifnei Rabbi Akiva v'tima'an. The case came before Rabbi Akiva, and he declared both of their sets of clothing to be tamei. And again, it sounds like anytime there's a case of mistaken identity, where you're putting on A thinking that it's B or vice versa, so then the clothing becomes tamei. So maskef la Rabbi Oshia, ela me'ata. So he says, I don't understand. You're telling me anytime there's case of mistaken identity, the object is tamei. So look at the following case. Hoshit yadu l'sal litol paschitin va'olsa biyado pasor. Let's say I stick my hand in a bread basket, thinking that I'm going to pull out a loaf of wheat bread, and I end up pulling out a loaf of barley bread by accident. Are you going to tell me, even though I'm tohar and I'm careful and meticulous about watching over myself to always be tohar, are you going to tell me hachanami denitmes? You're going to tell me that loaf of bread is tamei because it's mistaken? V'chitema hachanami, maybe you'll tell me that's taka the halacha, but the Brisa doesn't say that way. V'hatanya hamishamer es hachavis b'chezkas shel yayin v'nimsei shel shemen tahora milatame. That there's a Brisa that says that if you're watching over a barrel, you think that the contents of the barrel are wine, but in reality it turns out that the contents are oil, then the halacha is that it doesn't transmit tumah, even though it's a case of mistaken identity. So the Gemara says, you see from here that just because you're mistaken about what the status of the object or what the object is, doesn't mean it automatically becomes tamei. But wait a minute, but 1 second, take a look at the seifa of that very brisa. It says v'asura milechol, but you're not allowed to consume the oil, which implies that the oil does incur some level of tumah, even though it doesn't have enough tumah to impart that tumah to other things. So amai, why should that be? So Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, ba'omer shemartiha midavar hamitama'a v'lo midavar hapoisla. So Rabbi Yirmiyah explained that part isn't problematic. We're talking about a person who was watching over the contents the whole time. But he says, after we interrogate him, I was watching over it to make sure that a really high-level source of tumah would not come in contact with it, such that it would not be able to impart tumah if it became tamei to other things. But as far as lower-level tamei, things like rabbinic sources of tumah, like a person's non-clean hands, that I wasn't so careful to watch it from, and therefore we say, well, you were careful about certain things, but you weren't careful about other things, therefore it itself will be considered tamei because you weren't watching it from lower levels of tuma. But since you did watch it for higher levels of tuma, then it's not going to impart tuma, even though it's a case of mistaken identity. So, frek the Gemara. Before we get to the question, I mean, or we're up to the question, but before we try to resolve it, let's just question what we've just said. Umi ika netirusa lapalga. Since when do we say that a person watches something halfway? I watched it from incurring high level tuma, but I didn't watch it from low level tuma. So since when do we say that that's such a thing? The Gemara says in Vahatanya. Yes, I'll show you. There's a brisa that even actually talks about that, because there's a case like this: Hoshid yadu bisal v'hasal kasefo v'hamagreifa biso chasal. Person's got a basket on his shoulder and is filled with figs, like a cake of figs, and usually next to the cake of figs in the basket is a small little rake that you would use to separate the figs from each other. And v'haya belibo al hasal v'lohaya belibo al hamagreifa. So you were watching the basket all the time to make sure that no tumah came in contact with it, but you weren't fixated mentally on the rake that's in the basket. So hasal tohar v'hamagreifa tameya. So therefore the halacha is the basket is tohar, the rake is tamei. Hasal tohar to tamei hamagreifa l'sal. But wait a minute, if you're telling me that the basket is tohar, then why should it remain tohar? Let the rake that's inside the basket render the basket tamei. So the more answer is ein kli mitame kli, because one kli cannot impart tumah to another kli. But still, v'litame masha b'sal. But the contents of the basket should be tamei. The figs in the basket should be tamei because the rake is tamei. So Amar Ravina ba'omer shemartiv midavar shenit shemitama below midavar haposelo. And the answer is there too, is that a person says, I made sure that nothing came in contact with the rake that could make the rake so tamei that it could impart tumah onto food. But I wasn't careful to make sure that the rake would not come in contact with something that would render it tamei, even though it could not impart tumah to other things. So therefore you see very clearly that we can bifurcate it. We can say, you know what? Sometimes you watch over things to make sure that a high level of tumah doesn't come in contact, even though you're not watching over it to make sure that a low level tumah does not come in contact. But the bottom line is mikol makom kasha. But our question therefore still stands. Here we have a situation where a person says, I watched over this item thinking that it was wine, and it turns out to be oil. And yet we still say that it's going to retain its status of being Torah. It's not going to be able to make things tamei. So you see, even when there's a case of mistaken identity, we assume that your shmira is a good shmira, your watchfulness is a good watchfulness. How then can you suggest that just because a person put on a pair of clothing thinking that it was one thing and not another thing, that it's going to automatically be tamei? Va'od mosif Rabbi Baravua. Let me ask another question, says Rabbi Baravua. Ma'isa b'isha echa shabas lifnei Rabbi Yishmael. Here's the story about a woman who came before Rabbi Yishmael. Va'amra lo Rabbi, beged ze aragtiv b'tahara v'lohaya b'libi l'shomer b'tahara. That she tells him the following case. She says, you know what? I was weaving from thread to make a garment. And I wasn't thinking the whole time that I have to watch over this thing from becoming tamei. But after the fact, Rabbi, I can tell you with certainty that from the time that this thing started to become a garment, which is when when you have enough thread sewn into a swatch of fabric that you have 3 fingers by 3 fingers of fabric, I know for a fact that no tumah came in contact with it. So the shaila is that even though she wasn't thinking actively while it was being made into a beged that no tumah should come in contact with it, but in retrospect she testifies that no tumah came in contact with it, can you assume that the garment is tohar or not? Umitoch bediko shey Rabbi Yishmael bodka amrlo Rabbi nida mashcha imi bechevel. So Rabbi Yishmael interrogated her, and through the course of his interrogation, she was able to actually acknowledge that there was a woman who was a nida that was helping me thread the loom, and she may have actually placed her weight or leaned on one of the threads at the time when it was being woven into a swatch of fabric, and therefore it could taka have been tamei. So therefore Rabbi Yishmael was mitame. And as a result, Amar Rabbi Yishmael, Kama Gedolim Divrei Chachamim, Shahayu Omrim Belibo L'Shomro Tohar Ein Belibo L'Shomro Tamei. And Rabbi Yishmael therefore remarked afterwards, and he says, the rabbis were quite wise when they made this rule, that you can't, in retrospect, testify that there was no tumah because you're not so meticulous about your thoughts, about reconstructing what happened in the past in your mind. And therefore, the only time that we can say with certainty that the clothing, the fabric is tohar, is if the person watching it was having that in mind the whole time they were watching it. If they didn't have it in mind at the time when it was being woven into fabric, and only in retrospect they testify about it, that's not enough to ensure that it's going to be tohar, and therefore we assume that it's tameh. And this story is illustrative of that. Shuv ma'isa b'isha echa shabas lifnei Rabbi Yishmael. Here's another story, a very similar story. Another woman came in front of Rabbi Yishmael, and Amr lo Rabbi mapazu araktiha b'tahara v'lohaya b'libi l'shomra. That she says, Rabbi, even though I didn't have in mind while I was making this garment that I should watch over it and protect it from any tumah, I can testify in retrospect that there was no tumah ever introduced to it. But here too, umitoch bediko shahya Rabbi Yishmael bodka amar lo Rabbi nima nifsika li ukishartiha befeh. That she confessed and she said, you know what, you're right. What happened was that I wanted to start threading the loom, and what you do is you stick the thread in your mouth to moisten it so that it'll be easier to thread in the loom. And at that point, she was still a nida. Once she threaded the loom, she went to mikvah, and she figured, okay, now, for sure, there's nothing going to be tummy that's going to come in contact with it. But what she neglected to realize is that as long as the thread is still moist from her saliva, then once it's woven into a swatch of fabric, it now becomes tameh from the moistened thread, from her saliva, when she was a nida. So therefore Rabbi Yishmael said it's tameh. And once again, Amar Rabbi Yishmael, Kama Gedolim Divrei Chachamim Shayu Omrim Belibo Lishmor Tahor Ein Belibo L'Shamro Tameh. And therefore, once again, Rabbi Yishmael remarked how wise were the sages by saying that only when you're proactively thinking about tahara, when you're taking care, when you're manufacturing the garment, can we assume that the garment is tahar. But if not, not. But in any event, why do we bring in this whole bryce about Rabbi Yishmael and the woman? So the Gemara says, let's now reflect back on our previous cases. We have 3 cases that we mentioned before. One is a case where a guy dropped his handkerchief, and he asked his friend to pick it up. So there we said it's tameh. Case number 2, a guy thought that he was putting on big day chol, weekday clothing, and instead he puts on a Shabbos clothing. There too it's tameh. Case number 3, 2 women go to the mikvah, or the bathhouse, they accidentally switch their clothes. Both sets of clothes are tameh. So now let's look at it in the face of this brisa. So Bishlam al Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok. Now, according to what was Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok's case? Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok's case was the 2 women who went to the bathhouse, right? And they accidentally switched their clothes. The reason why it makes sense to say over there that both sets of clothing are tameh is kol echas ve'echas, each dress is tameh. Kol echas ve'echas omeres chaverti eishes am haaretz umascha daita mina. Because I don't know who that lady is, says one lady about the other lady. I don't know whether she's an Am Haaretz, whether she's a Prushi or not. And therefore, I have to assume that this lady is not meticulous about the laws of Tahara. So as soon as I realize that she put on my dress, I assume it's Tameh. I no longer am watching over it to make sure that it's Tahar. And once I have that Hesach Hadas, that interruption in my thoughts, then it's all for fallen, and that dress is now tameh. Even if it turns out that she is a prushi after the fact, but it's too late. I've already had a hesach hadas. So that makes sense why, in a case of switched dresses in the bathhouse, both dresses are tameh. And Rabbi Yonasan ben Amram nami. Now, the case of Rabbi Yonasan ben Amram, what is that? That's the case of where a person accidentally put on Shabbos clothes instead of weekday clothes. Kaven de Kalim de Shabbos Avil Hushimar Tvei Masach Daitu Minayu. So we know that on Shabbos you're even more careful about Tahara than you are during the week because it's a holier day. So as soon as you realize that you put on Shabbos clothing by accident instead of Chulin clothing, we automatically assume that you've sort of tainted in your mind the status of the Shabbos clothing. And so therefore, in order to wear this on Shabbos again, you're going to have to take it to the mikveh in order to upgrade it back to its Shabbos state of Tahara. That I can understand as well, says the Gemara. But Elul Rabbi Yonasan ben Elazar, but what about the case of where the guy has a handkerchief that falls out of his pocket and he says to his friend, would you mind picking that up for me? Navid lahu shimur biyadei dechavre. I'm watching the guy. I'm watching him pick it up. So why isn't it sufficient by the fact that I'm watching him the whole time that I can watch over it? So Amar Rabbi Yochanan chazaka ein adam mishamer masha biyad chavero. The answer is that you see from this halacha that there's no such thing as watchfulness for the laws of tahara when something is out of my hands and in someone else's hands. If you go back to Rashi up above with Divrei HaMaschil Timeya, Rashi explains. He says that based on this chazaka, leficha hulo shomer biyad chavero, that therefore it's not possible for me to watch something carefully when it's in my friend's hands, when it's out of my hands. And v'gam zeh shenasna lo hayachash l'shomro. And the guy also, my friend that I asked to pick up the handkerchief, he's not careful to watch over it from becoming tamei. Why? Demeimar Omar, Kevin Sha'omar li tanali, v'hu eni yodeim tamei aniyim tohar, lo chash l'taharasa. The fact that my friend asked me to pick up his handkerchief without asking me first, am I tamei or tohar, must mean that he doesn't care about whether it's tamei or tohar, and therefore I'm not going to be thinking about preserving its tahara. So therefore, neither the owner of the hanky nor the friend of the owner is going to be careful about watching over it to make sure that it's always in its state of tahara. And that's the principle. So now the Gemara says, oh really, v'lo? What about the following brisa? V'hatanya. Harei shahayu chamarav upoalav tu'unin taharas. Let's look at a brisa that says as follows. Let's say you have a guy who has a bunch of employees, and they're camel drivers, they're workers, and they're carrying a person's wine and oil that is tahor, and they're in earthenware vessels, and the only way that you'd be able to render the thing tamei is if you'd have to open up the barrel, stick your hand in, and touch the stuff and render it tamei. So afal pi shehiflig mehen yoser mimil taharos of taharos. Then even if you're a meal away, which is like a kilometer distant from your workers, you can assume that the contents are still tahor. Here you see that even though it's in my friend's hands, I can still be fixated on it, even at a distance, and still watch over its tahara. Not like you just said in the case of the handkerchief. Why is that? Now, the second part of the brisa says, V'im omar lahu lahem, rather, l'chu v'ani avo acharechem, kevin shenis'almu einov mehen taharos of timeos. But if you tell the workers, you guys go ahead and I'll catch up with you later, so then as soon as you lose sight of the workers, then all of your wine is tamei. So the Gemara says, Maishna Reisha, Maishna Seifa. So first of all, what's the difference between the Reisha and the Seifa? Amar Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha, Reisha b'metaher chamar avu po'alav lekach. So Rabbi Yitzchak says, the Reisha was talking about a case where you took your workers to the mikveh, and you said, guys, I'm having you handle very precious cargo that has to remain tohar, so you guys go to the mikveh, and I'm going to send you ahead, but I'm going to be with you, right? Or you say, you just go ahead and take care of it. And so we said, even if you're at a kilometer's distance, the stuff is still tahor. So ihachi seifa nami. Well then if that's the case, well then why in the seifa, when you said you'll catch up with them, is the stuff tamei? You had them go to the mikveh. The Gemara's answer is, Ein am ha'aretz makbid al maga chavero, because even though the workers went to the mikveh, but they have a status of an am haaretz. They themselves in their personal lives are not meticulous about tumah. So even though they're tohor, but if they meet their friend on the road and their friend says, hey, Joe, how you doing? Hey, what you got there? Wine. Oh, let's take a look. He's not going to be so concerned about stopping his friend from touching it because it's his friend. So therefore, even though the worker is tahor, but his friend, the friend of the worker, may be tamei, and that's why you have to worry. So the Gemara says, Zihachi Reisha Nami. Well, then why don't you have to worry about that in the Reish in the first case? So Bivolahem derech akalson. The answer is because the worker knows that you could always take a shortcut and catch up with him and see what the guy's doing at any time. And if that's the case, he has this fear of being caught. of having the boss see that someone is opening up the barrel, and therefore he's going to make sure that no one is going to be tampering with the barrels of wine. So the Gemara says, "Ihachi seifa nami." So then, why in the sefer are they not fearful? Because keven da'amr lahu lechu v'ani avo acharecha mismach samcha daitayim. The answer is because in the sefer, because the boss said, "You guys go ahead and I'll catch up with you later." He's explicitly told them that they're going to be alone for a while, and that's why they're not intimidated, they're not fearful, and they may let their friend Joe touch the wine. But the bottom line is, says the Gemara, is that in a situation where the workers are fearful that they're going to get caught having tumah exposed to these contents, then you can be assured, even if it's in someone else's possession, that it's going to remain tahor. In the case of the handkerchief, however, the guy that's picking it up for you, he's not intimidated by you. He just thinks that you're not worried about the laws of tumah at all. And that's why when he picks it up for you, you have a hesach hadas, he has a hesach hadas, and therefore the whole thing is for fallen, and that you have to take the handkerchief to the mikveh. Okay, hadron alach ein dorshin.
Is this a problem even where, for example, like the Hesses Kashrus, where it's sealed and signed? Let's say these bottles are sealed, signed, delivered, right?
Yeah, so what all the laws of chosmos that you're referring to have to do with basar shenisalim in ha'ayin, and it's very difficult to extrapolate from one realm of halacha to another. I won't even venture to do that. It could be, you're right, it could be that they are comparable, but I'm not sure, and I don't know really.
Is there a downside for Rabbi like then to Paskin that he's going to be machmir and the guy has to go to take the clothes to the mikveh, and could they brachas levatala, like that kind of thing?
No, we're not dealing with brachas here. The Gemara Bichlal, in most of these cases, you wouldn't make a bracha because these are all rabbinic tumah.
So you just take it.
Yeah, the thing you'd have to worry about is passeling truma and passeling kudshim unnecessarily. And the question would be, how do you deal with these things that are now passel, which are only passel midirabanan? You can't destroy it because it has a kedusha to it. So that would be another discussion. That would be not for now. Next, go on to the next mission, which is continuing this discussion about taharos. Chomer bekodesh mibatruma. Now, here, the Mishnah is going to make a whole bunch of distinctions between kudshim and truma. Now, you know, they're both holy items, but truma is of a lower level of kedusha than kudshim. Kudshim is sacrificial meat, sacrificial flour, right? Things that are used sacrificially. Truma is an agricultural tithe that is given to the Kohen, that once it's tithe, it has a status of Kedusha, but it has a lower level of Kedusha than Kudshim, and as a result, there are certain stringencies that we place upon Kudshim that we don't place upon Truma. So let's see a number of these stringencies. One is Shemat Bilin Kalim B'soch Kalim L'Truma Avalo L'Kodesh. One distinction is that when you have, let's say, a small jug inside a big pot, you can take them to the mikveh that way if you're being toivel them in order to use them for eating truma. But if you're using these kalim in order to eat kudshim, you can't toivel two kalim together, one inside the other. You have to pull the small one out of the big one, and dunk them separately. That's chumrah number one. Chumrah number two, achurayim v'tochu beisat tzvita b'truma avalo b'kodesh. Let's say there are three different parts of the kli, and what the Mishnah is discussing is you have an inside, you have an outside, and you have a handle area. So vis-a-vis the laws of truma, when a rabbinic tumah comes in contact with that kli, if it only touches the handle, it doesn't disqualify the contents. But that's only true with truma. But if it's with kudshim, then even if a rabbinic source of tumah were to touch the handle, that would disqualify the entire kli, and therefore the contents would be considered tameh. Next, hanoseyas hamidras noseyas hatruma v'lo hakodesh. Let's say you're carrying in one hand a shoe that was stepped on by a zav, a person who's an av hatumah. So this shoe now is tameh. That's okay if you're carrying it in one hand, in one hand, and then in the other hand you're carrying a utensil that contains truma. That's okay, since you're not handling you're not allowing the shoe to come in direct contact with the truma, so then you're okay. But if you're handling kudshim, we don't allow you to hold the shoe in one hand and the container holding the kudshim in the other hand. Let's go on. Let's go on to the next one. the next chumrah, the next distinction between truma and kachim. Big day ochle truma midrash lakodesh. Right, that this is something we saw in the previous Mishnah. A person's clothing, a person who's a truma eater, his clothing is considered to be tameh for a person who wishes to eat kachim. Next chumrah. Lo kemidas hakodesh midas hatruma shebekodesh matru umenagev umatbil v'achar kach kosher uvetruma kosher v'achar kach matbil kelim v'achar kach matbil. Period. Another distinction is that when you want to take a fabric utensil, let's say it's a bag that holds food and it has a drawstring to close it. So then in those situations, if it's for handling truma and you want to take it to mikveh, you don't need to untie the drawstring before taking it to the mikveh. But with a bag that's going to be used to hold kachim, you have to completely untie all strings before you take it to the mikveh. That's another chumrah. Another chumrah. Kelim hanigmorim b'taharat tzrichim tefila l'kodesh, avolo l'truma. If you just finished manufacturing a utensil and you were careful during the manufacturing process that it should not be exposed to any tumah, that's not enough if it's kachim. You still have to take it to the mikveh before you use it for kachim. But with truma, you don't have to take it to the mikveh, you can use it right away. Another distinction. Hakli mitzaref masha b'socho l'kodesh avolo l'truma. Let's say you have a very wide trough that is containing multiple items inside, the dry items inside the trough, such that the items are not necessarily touching each other. You have like a whole bunch of beans or little cupcakes or whatever it is. So when it comes to the law of truma, if one item in the trough is tameh and the other item in the trough is tahor, then whatever is tameh remains tameh and whatever is tahor remains tahor. But when it comes to the laws of kachim, the very fact that they're inside the same utensil, even when they're not touching, everything becomes tameh if even one of the items inside the trough is tameh. That's another chumrah. Let's go on. Haravi'i b'kodesh pasul v'ashlishi b'truma. Another thing, which is something that we've learned before many times, is that with truma, you go 3 levels down. With kachim, you go 4 levels down. So, for example, with truma, you have an avhatuma. It touches something, and that something, which is, let's say, usually a food item, becomes a rishon l'tuma. Then that rishon touches another item, and that becomes a sheni. Then the sheni touches a third item, and if that item is truma, then that becomes tameh. But that truma, if it touches other truma, then that other truma does not become tameh, because you only go down to a shlishi, you don't go down any further. But with kachim, you go down a 4th level, and therefore a shlishi can render something that's kachim into ravi. Okay. Uvitruma im nitmes echas miyadav chaverta tahora, uvikodesh matbil shtehem shehayad metami es chaverta. Another distinction is that we know that rabbinically you can your hands could be tameh even though the rest of your body is tahor, and that's in a situation where you know that you're tahor, but you just had a hesach hadas and you weren't watching carefully over your hands. So then we require you to wash your hands, right? So when it comes to my desire to eat truma, if I know that I was watchful over one hand, but I wasn't watchful over the other hand, I can just wash the one hand that I wasn't watchful over, and both hands are now tameh. But with kachim, if I want to eat kachim, even if I was only mesiach das, I only didn't think about one hand, I have to wash both hands because of the fear that they may have come in contact with each other. Okay. Shayad metam escharet bekodesh v'lo b'truma. Now, ochlin neguvim biyadayim misuavos b'truma avolo b'kodesh. Another distinction is that the only time I have to worry about unclean hands is if my hands are moist or wet. But if my hands are dry and I want to eat truma, then I don't have to wash them beforehand. But with kachim, even if my hands are dry, I have to wash them nonetheless. And finally, the Mishnah says, Ha'oneinu mechusar kippurim tzrichim tefila l'kodesh avolo l'truma. Now, both an onein and a person who has gone to the mikveh to purify himself from tumah, both of these people are temporarily precluded from eating kachim and from eating truma. That's what they have in common. When you're an onein, it's your first day of the burial, you're not allowed to eat kachim or truma. When you've just been recovered from being a zav, let's say, and you haven't yet brought your karbanos, you're also precluded from eating truma and from eating kachim. But you've purified yourself. You're not tamei anymore, so therefore you can eat truma right away. Not so with kachim. By kachim, anytime you're temporarily precluded from eating kachim, even though you've already gone through a tahara process, once you're able to physically eat kachim again, you have to go to mikveh once again. So therefore, even though you've already been toivel from your being a zav, but you haven't yet brought your karbanos yet, once you bring the karbanos, you got to go to mikveh again before we allow you to eat the kachim. Another chumrah by kachim only and not by truma. You all have a wonderful day.